The sun had not yet risen over Johannesburg, but the city's restless hum was already creeping through the cracks of the glass towers and dusty streets. Zola Thabane stood on the edge of her penthouse balcony, the wind tugging at her wavy black hair, her hazel eyes scanning the distant skyline like a predator waiting for the right moment. She could almost feel the pulse of the city below, the exhaust fumes, the honking taxis, the sharp laughter of early morning vendors, but it felt detached, irrelevant. Because today, all of it, every polished street and towering glass building, belonged to a world she had once been exiled from. Her hand rested on the cold steel railing, knuckles white, as memories of her childhood clawed their way up from the depths of her mind. She had been 7 when Bheki Thabane, her father, had dismissed her existence with the curtness of a corporate memo. The child he never acknowledged, hidden behind a web of secrets and shame, left to grow in the shadows of poverty while her father built empires. The betrayal had been invisible to the world, but indelible on her heart. The world had called him a titan. To her, he had been a storm that shattered everything fragile in her life. Even now, 21 years later, the sting of rejection could still rise unbidden. Her mother's whispered warnings, the nights of empty stomachs, the mocking children in her neighborhood, they had carved resilience into her bones. Zola inhaled sharply, smelling the faint metallic scent of the city mixed with the dry edge of early spring dust. Her eyes narrowed. Today was the culmination. Today was not about revenge, it was about justice, inevitability, and the quiet triumph of survival. Bheki's office, perched on the 51st floor of Thabane Enterprises, gleamed in the first light. Glass walls reflected the awakening city, and inside, Bheki's presence was as imposing as ever. He moved with measured precision, his tall frame and tailored dark suit exuding authority, yet a subtle unease lingered. He could feel a change in the air, a tension he could not name. Perhaps it was the stirrings of a new board member he hadn't expected, or perhaps it was just the weight of his own past brushing against him. Bheki had always prided himself on control, but control had a peculiar way of unraveling when the unacknowledged ghosts of one's past returned. When Zola first walked through the doors of Thabane Enterprises that morning, she had been invisible to him. She had smiled politely at receptionists, navigated the elevator with the poise of someone born into wealth, even though she had grown up learning to make do with less than enough. She had observed everything, the layout of the office, the personalities, the weaknesses hidden behind polished smiles. She had done her homework meticulously. She had waited patiently for the right time. The truth, as she had learned from years of whispered corporate secrets and leaked financial statements, was that the empire was not unassailable. It had cracks, and she had the means to exploit them without needing permission. By mid-morning, the boardroom was thick with anticipation. Bheki sat at the head of the table, surrounded by advisors and executives who once believed their loyalty could shield them from consequences. Thabo Dlami, his most trusted lieutenant, shifted nervously as Zola entered. Her presence was calm but deliberate, her tailored beige blazer and silk blouse impeccable, the faint glint of subtle gold jewelry catching the morning light. There was something in the way she held herself, a confidence that suggested she had learned early how to navigate a world that tried to erase her, that unsettled Bheki more than he could articulate. "Good morning," Zola said, her voice steady, yet underlined with a softness that hinted at the emotional terrain beneath. Her hazel eyes met Bheki's for the first time, unflinching. "I am here to discuss a potential acquisition." Bheki blinked, unprepared for the gravity hidden behind the calm professionalism of a woman he did not recognize. "Acquisition?" he asked, his tone cautious, but curiosity flickering like a candle in the dark. "Yes," Zola replied, placing the sleek leather folder on the table. "I've been reviewing Thabane Enterprises holdings. I believe there's an opportunity for strategic realignment, one that could maximize efficiency and profitability." There was a moment of silence that stretched too long, heavy with unspoken tension. Thabo cleared his throat, glancing at Bheki, who had leaned back in his chair, assessing her as though she were a riddle he could not yet solve. He had no memory of this young woman's existence, no awareness that she carried not just the intellect, but the rightful claim to his legacy. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, as if anticipating the storm about to arrive. "You've done your homework," Bheki said finally, his voice betraying only a fraction of his inner unease. "Who are you representing?" Zola met his gaze directly. "Myself," she said. And in that word was a universe of meaning, a reclamation of years lost to disownership and silence. The past pressed against her in flashes, her mother's worn hands, the nights of scraping together meager meals, the school uniform patched and frayed. She had been forced to learn early how to survive in a world that turned its back on her, and that survival had shaped every decision, every plan, every quiet hour spent preparing for the day she could stand before him, not as a child, but as an equal, a power he could not deny. Lindiwe, her loyal friend and confidant, had been her shadow in this journey, providing emotional grounding when determination alone threatened to consume her. "You are ready," Lindiwe whispered that morning, squeezing her hand as they left the elevator together. "Remember, it's not revenge, it's rightful ownership." Bheki's recollections were fragmented yet sharp. The faint cry of a little girl in the foyer, a woman he had kept secret because acknowledging her would have meant admitting fault, shame, and vulnerability. That little girl had grown, and now, standing before him, she carried the calm certainty of someone who had survived every storm he thought she would crumble under. Humiliation was in this realization, a subtle tremor beneath his otherwise unshakable veneer. The negotiations began with formalities, but Zola's strategy was impeccable. She had invested quietly, acquired key shares over the years, learned the weak points in management, and now leveraged them silently. Naledi Piri, Bheki's corporate rival who had secretly mentored Zola, watched from the sidelines with a quiet satisfaction, seeing the perfect orchestration of a long-awaited comeuppance. Zola's calm questions exposed inefficiencies, her insights challenged assumptions, and the executives who once revered Bheki found themselves nodding in reluctant agreement with a woman they barely knew. As the hours stretched, the room's atmosphere shifted. The calculated politeness began to fracture under the weight of truth. Thabo, usually imperturbable, exchanged uneasy glances with Bheki. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible recognition in Zola's movements, an inherited acumen, a keen understanding of the company's pulse that unsettled everyone, especially the man who had disowned her. "Let me be clear," Bheki said, voice low and controlled, trying to regain command. "This is still my company. You are an outsider. How do you—" He stopped mid-sentence, the words failing as the realization dawned. Zola's ownership stake was now substantial, acquired legally, silently, methodically. "How did you—" She replied evenly, the faintest quiver of suppressed emotion in her voice. "I invested. I worked while others ignored the possibility. I've learned your strengths and weaknesses. I've prepared for this moment. And now I am here not to ask permission, but to assume responsibility." The room fell silent. The weight of history, betrayal, and survival pressed against the walls. Bheki's jaw tightened, pride and shame warring within him. He had built an empire, yes, but he had ignored the child who had inherited not just his blood, but his sharp mind and determination. That oversight, that act of disownership, now threatened to unravel everything. Zola's eyes softened for a fraction of a second, the little girl who had been abandoned peeking through the armor of power. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said. "I am here because I had to reclaim what was mine, what was taken from me." The mid-story twist arrived with brutal clarity. The board voted unanimously to approve her acquisition proposal. Bheki had no allies left who could block the inevitable. The humiliation, once invisible, was now palpable. A hidden child, someone he had dismissed, someone he thought powerless, had returned to claim her rightful place. By the afternoon, the transaction was complete. Zola stood outside the now empty office, feeling a surge of victory, tempered by complex emotions. She had done more than buy a company. She had reclaimed her narrative, her identity, and her power. Bheki watched her go, the weight of decades pressing on him, realizing that wealth alone could never protect him from the consequences of neglect, pride, and human frailty. In the quiet that followed, the city hummed as it always had, indifferent to personal triumphs and tragedies. Yet for Zola, every honking taxi, every early morning market call, every flicker of light across the sky, they were echoes of a journey that began in silence and rejection and ended in undeniable presence. She had once been the child no one claimed. Now she stood as the woman no one could ignore. The victory in the boardroom was concrete, measured in numbers and shares, but its weight was felt in subtler ways. Staff whispered her name with newfound respect. Executives who had once questioned her presence now sought her approval. And Bheki, seated in his office, could only watch as the daughter he had dismissed reshaped the world he thought he controlled. Pride and regret warred silently in his eyes, and for the first time he understood that no amount of wealth could cover the scars of absence and denial. Zola walked through the city streets that evening, letting the familiar sense of market spices and warm asphalt wash over her. She paused at a corner, where a streetlight flickered against the damp pavement, and allowed herself a brief smile. Years of silence, endurance, and strategy had led to this moment. The little girl who once crouched in a cold, empty room had grown into a woman who not only survived, but commanded her rightful place. Every hardship, every whispered insult, every night spent hungry or unseen had been transformed into resilience. That night, as the city lights reflected in the windows of her penthouse, Zola thought of her mother, the quiet force that had carried her through childhood. Every lesson, every whispered word of encouragement had been a guidepost, a reminder that identity and self-worth could never be stolen. For Zola, victory was never about revenge. It was about justice, acknowledgement, and the profound satisfaction of truth finally recognized. Bheki, alone in the high-rise office he had built, finally allowed himself to confront the consequences of his choices. His empire was intact, yes, but its pulse was now shared, monitored, and shaped by the very child he had disowned. The realization settled in him like a slow dawn. Life's greatest lessons are rarely taught in classrooms or boardrooms. They are taught in the absence of what we take for granted, in the hearts we fail to nurture, and in the moments we ignore. As Zola looked out over Johannesburg, the sun dipping behind the skyline, she felt no bitterness, only clarity. The city moved on around her, as it always had, but she had carved her own space in it, unshakable, unignored, undeniable. Her journey had been long, fraught with pain, and yet it had led to this, a world in which she was seen, respected, and finally at peace with herself. Some stories end with revenge. Hers ended with recognition, resilience, and the quiet triumph of truth.